Welcome to Why Is This Good? A podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
Okay, you picked a story this week and it's a little different, so why don't you tell us about it?
I picked a story by Curtis Sittenfeld, which she wrote for a New York Times experiment in which she wrote a story and ChatGPT wrote a story or something like that. And like they wanted to see if people could tell whose was whose. And we're going to link to that article in the notes. So if anybody wants to go read it before we give away the answer, do that now. But the story is her story, which is one of the two stories that appears in the article. It's called You Probably Can See Where This Is Going, which is interesting. I would have written You Can Probably See Where This Is Going.
Exactly. I would have too.
So that's how you know it wasn't ChatGPT.
Yeah. There was a slight error.
Just an idiosyncratic stylistic choice.
Okay, so you're going to read from her story.
Yes, because that's the story we're featuring.
Sure.
The Uber let me out about 100 feet from Lake Como, and I walked toward the pavilion. A band Brian liked was performing at 7, and when I'd admitted I'd never been to Como Park, he'd replied, "You're not one of those Minneapolis people with a superiority complex over St. Paul, are you?" I'd written, "Nope, my superiority complex is for totally different reasons." Outside the pavilion's restaurant, I spotted a bearded bald guy. He wore a blue t-shirt, jeans, and flip-flops. From a few feet away, I said, "Brian?" And he raised his eyebrows and said, "Cassie? Should we hug?" I asked, and he smiled such a warm and sincere seeming smile that even though I'd been on far too many mediocre dates for extravagant optimism, I was gripped by extravagant optimism. "Yes," he said, "we should." We stepped into each other's arms. Online for beers, I felt as if I were on a reality show about middle-aged Manhattan women who travel to Minnesota to go on dates with hot, outdoorsy middle-aged men. Then we carried our drinks outside. I rarely drank beer, but it seemed Midwestern, and all the picnic tables were full, so we walked along the lake until we found an empty bench. It was 70 degrees. The sunlight was golden, and the trees were lushly green. Why didn't I live in Minnesota? We discussed where we'd grown up, me in DC, him in Duluth, our jobs, I refrained from mentioning my employer's location, and our first marriages. His had lasted 13 years, mine 21. When he casually asked, "And what year did you move here?" I hesitated before blurting out, "2019. I really almost never lied, in life or on dates, and I deeply regretted the necessity." Both to change the subject and because it was true, I gestured toward the multiple pedal boats out on the lake, whose prows were shaped like the heads of swans, and said, "Is it cheesy to say I love those?" "It's cheesy," he said, "but in a good way." He glanced at his watch. "The band is starting, though."
Well, I guess we could talk a little bit about why you picked it, huh? Had you read this before?
I had never
Yeah.
read it before. Obviously,
Yeah.
it was in our newsletter, and I was reading it. And the reason I picked it was because I could tell immediately. But for the ChatGPT story, while I was reading it, already knowing that the previous story was Sittenfeld's story, I was like, "This reads like a bad workshop story. Like someone has submitted this to our workshop in a different guise, and this is like I feel the urge to like make all the comments I would normally make for a workshop story for a bad workshop story." So I was like, we could probably learn a lot on the podcast talking about that.
Oh,
So that's
sure.
why I brought it. That's why I picked it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to that point, we talk a lot about this. I feel like mostly outside the podcast, the urge to criticize stories that we know are bad versus what we do on the podcast often, which is praise stories that we've intentionally chosen, which we know are published and like kind of revered.
Find stuff to learn from them.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a lot about your mindset. So, point being that I think we're best at criticizing, but we don't necessarily always do it here. And what a great opportunity to read, a pretty crappy story and to apply everything that we've learned about the good ones directly.
I should say I suspected and then basically confirmed that Curtis
Yes,
Sittenfeld's story was the first one within the first paragraph.
right.
The main clue that I came across was with this long hyphenate when she's like, "It was the same ask not one question James I'd gone out with around Christmas." And that ask not one question is all hyphenated. And I was like, there's
Yes.
no way ChatGPT is spitting that out.
No.
And then there's a couple of italics, like there's an italics in the second paragraph. And the way the italics are, it's like she says, "Three of his 5 photos featured him on a bike. I swear that mountain biker 1971 and I already had exchanged generic greetings." That second, "I swear," that's italicized, just felt too much like
Yeah,
a
humor.
writer. Yeah.
Yeah,
And just
exactly.
different things like that. And by the time I got to the ChatGPT one, there was so much bad bad writing. It was like, this is just confirmed.
Oh, yeah. I remember when I first read both, I didn't bother with this big introduction, which talks a lot about the prompts that it gave both writers.
Oh, yes.
So I didn't know necessarily that flip-flops were supposed to play this like big role, you know?
Yes.
Well, not that it was going to play a big role, but that it was explicitly mentioned in the prompt. And it was supposed to just like be part of some kind of a background vibe for the story because they were trying to say, like, what is a beach read, you know? And they're like, well, it's light and it's airy and it's about love and lust and blah, 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 and flip-flops. And they just kind of like shoehorn that in. But ChatGPT, if you've ever used it, and I have a lot, I use it a lot. I'll use it to like outline like questions for interview sources. I'll use it to like outline a story when I'm just like really struggling. And this is for freelance writing, a lot of copywriting. There's clients that I work with that won't allow it, and I'm paranoid. And I run my own stuff through ChatGPT checkers afterwards, so I don't even look like I did use it, you know, for those
Yeah.
clients. For those clients, I'm so fucking paranoid. But anyway, I've used ChatGPT a lot, and I've used it for fun too. And one of the things that you realize is that if you do give it an explicit prompt, like include flip-flops, it will go overboard. And that's
Yeah.
exactly what happened in this result. Like, if we went through and highlighted, I think they probably mentioned the word flip-flops like 10 times. It could have been like a really powerful like symbol or theme or something. And instead, it's just like inserted, inserted, inserted. It's like following instructions.
That was like one of the main things that made it feel like a workshop story because people will find like some small thing, some like thing,
Right.
and write a story around that thing. And like
Yeah.
almost like they are ChatGPT. It's like, write a story about this. And it's just this like kind of empty thing that has that one detail in it. There was a series of stories like years ago, people were submitting stories, and I actually wrote, inspired by all these kind of nothing stories. I wrote a little thing I titled Excerpts from the Book of Banalities, just a bunch of like little banal stories, quasi stories, like in a list. Like, here's one about driving in traffic. Here's one about reading a book on a bus. Here's one about, something else. Then I try to do something. I put a school shooting in the middle of it as like trying to make it about the banality of school shootings. But the original inspiration for that was just this banality of these ideas. And the flip-flop thing felt like that.
Right. Yeah.
Because it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't mean anything. It's
It
just a
could.
thing.
Yeah.
In this story, yeah.
In this story. And like the reason why I say it could even for this is that I feel like my biggest complaint with this, maybe my biggest clue was the flip-flops. And it really wasn't the flip-flops. That I think was like the dead giveaway. I think from the very beginning, it's just like a very practiced kind of self-conscious story. Whereas like Curtis Sittenfeld maybe uses a phrase like the one that you saw, which is all hyphenated. And she's not wondering to herself, will the audience like this? Will they care that I did this way? Like she's taking what I feel like are little like stylistic risks in line with her own voice, and ChatGPT is completely devoid of voice, right? It's self-conscious in the fact that it's trying to fit in.
Yeah.
Not because it's like a sentient robot, but because it's like it's following rules, it's trying to mimic other people. It's not being itself or trying to express something on its own. It's been given instructions.
It's doing tens of thousands of matrix transforms and
Yeah.
attaching like vectors in high dimensional space to word tokens.
Yeah, it's working so hard right now. It does not have a chance to do that. But the reason why, okay, so flip-flops for me, like I said, were the dead giveaway. It's like, okay, this was part of the prompt. Like you said, it doesn't go anywhere in this story. But for me, the part that was so disappointing about this ChatGPT story and the real obvious difference was that the story does not even take place on the page. So like there's two instances where the main character, Lydia, has conversations with men, and neither of the conversations are played on the page. We don't get to see either of the conversations. The first is a random man, and the
Yeah.
second, she intentionally walks up to another man. Her flip-flops are slapping on the floor, and she says, I noticed your flip-flops to the man. They're kind of carefree, and that's the impetus for this conversation. And then there's a paragraph that says, they talked. The
Yes.
conversation flowed easily. David was charming and engaging with a disarming honesty that Lydia found refreshing. They spoke about their lives, their interests, and the little quirks that made them unique. For a while, Lydia forgot about her practical life and lost herself in the moment. What? I mean, like, that's the whole fucking conversation. And then the next paragraph is the story, really. It was only when the conversation began to dwindle and David suggested they meet again that Lydia felt a pang of regret. She was in her 40s, a mother, a widow. What was she doing? Flirting with a stranger in a coffee shop. I want to watch her realize that even as he's charming her. more, you know, like that's the story. That's the beach read.
Yeah.
That's the character. And instead we're just told, we're not shown.
That's right. That's right. That's one of those paragraphs that I very specifically would have commented if this were in the workshop. I'd say, hey, bring us some specific details. Like,
Yeah.
this is empty. There's nothing going on here. I think it's vague generalities, like you said, but specific details will make it better. The funny thing is that that paragraph that you read contrasts exactly with a paragraph that I read just a minute ago in Sittenfeld's story. We discussed where we'd grown up, me in DC, him in Duluth, our jobs. I
Yeah.
refrained from mentioning my employer's location, and our first marriages. His lasted 13 years. Those are all specific details that make the conversation. Like, she's summarizing a conversation
She's still
exactly the
summarizing,
same
right?
way, but it's summarized with specific
Right.
concrete details that let us like understand what the moves of the conversation were.
Right.
And it doesn't end with an airy general. It ends with, when he casually asked a direct quote, and what year did you move here? I hesitated before blurting out 2019. And then it ends with her kind of like introspection about that lie. I really almost never lied in life or on dates, and I deeply regretted the necessity. So it's like it builds up to a moment, right? It's not just a summary, but it's also building up to something. Not just this kind of vague, Lydia forgot about her practical life and lost herself in the moment. It's a specific, like, internal conflict.
Right.
There's another conversation that's the conversation that happens in the date. The other conversation that this Lydia has is with her friend Julie before she starts talking to the guy. And it's done in the exact same way. They talked about their lives. Julie's recent move to a beach town and Lydia's endless work days, the responsibilities being a single mother, the growing distance from her teenage son. They laughed about old times and reminisced about their college days. And for a moment, Lydia felt something she hadn't in a while, a spark of connection, of vitality. That one's slightly better, but it's still kind of vague and generalized, right? It doesn't have those concrete details, the specific details
Right.
that like attach to her more specifically than, or to the
Yeah.
two of them, to both of them.
Right. And maybe it's good to point out that paragraph that you read in Curtis Sittenfeld's, just because, like you said, it is summarizing, it is telling, but the concrete details are doing the work. Because these are both such short stories, it's not as if we're supposed to like dive into the paragraph that I read, which is she was in her 40s, a mother, a widow. What was she doing? Like, I mean, that's a good way to summarize it versus getting really into the nitty gritty of like how that emotion might play out in a longer piece. But still, I would argue that those two paragraphs that I read would serve as the prompt for the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Tell us about a
That's the
conversation with a
moment,
man that she's
right?
stressed out about for these reasons. And instead, it's like she had a nice conversation, but she didn't really know what she was going to do with it. And then at the end of the story, she literally just like walks back to her friend and she's like, well, I did it. That's it.
Yeah.
And at least it ends in a way that does not suggest much else, you know? A lot of times when we finish a short story in our workshop, people will say things like, I want to know more. And a lot of times people think that that's like a positive thing. And I usually am like on the fence about whether that's a positive thing because I feel like, you know, I should know it within the story. I shouldn't be waiting for part two. But I liked that Curtis Sittenfeld's story did sort of end on this like hopeful note where you found yourself wanting to read more about these characters that she very quickly introduced. And you found yourself kind of hoping that like it turned out for that character. And with this Lydia thing, you're like, the end, thank God. I don't care. There's nothing, like nothing else is going to happen. These people are flat and boring, and it does feel like an ending. And I wonder if ChatGPT is like took the idea of like a short story as like a very concrete finished product, you know?
I don't think it thinks in any kind of.
But do you know what I mean? If you had told this thing to end on a cliff note, it would have done that. It would have come up with something, like I
Oh
guarantee
yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. It could have easily, yeah. End on a
Yeah.
cliffhanger. End on a moment of triumph. End on a whatever.
Yeah,
It
but
it,
if you
it
don't
can.
articulate it, yeah, you're just kind of like write a short story and then it does.
Yeah,
And
I
that's it.
think the one of the things I appreciated about Sittenfeld's story was it ended on a well, I want to go back to what you said about wanting to see more, but about her story, it ended on ambiguity.
Yes.
She's building up throughout this whole story. Like in the early part of the story, there's a moment where she says, "So far, I'd answered no question untruthfully," but she knows she's hiding the fact that she's not from the area, that she's just
Yeah.
visiting for 36 hours, and she hasn't told him.
Right.
She was about to tell him, and he texted her something else, and she deleted it. And so that sets up like this whole strand that runs through the whole thing. That's like this tension that like he doesn't know that I'm just visiting. He doesn't know I'm just visiting. So like later she refers to this growing deceit, stuff like that. It just keeps coming up. This is like back of her mind. You know, even the paragraph I read as an example of the or from this is, I almost never lied in life or on dates. And that was the first time she had actually lied when she said 2019
Right.
when I
Right.
got
Right.
here.
Right.
Right. Instead of just this morning. So when it ends with her friend says, these are your choices. If you ghost him,
Yeah.
it's definitely the end. But if you tell him the truth, maybe it's the beginning. It's an ambiguous ending, but it's building on the exact theme that she's been developing through the whole
Yeah.
thing. Right. So
Right.
it's satisfying in that way, even though it leaves open what might happen next. It's like,
Yeah.
are you
Good
going to
point.
live with the lying or are you going to come clean? And
Right.
then that's, we can imagine what happens next. We don't even need to see what happens next because it's already been implied. It's already been given to us, which is kind of when people say, I want to see more, sometimes they mean you didn't give me enough in this story to understand everything. And sometimes they mean I like this character so much that I want to spend more time with them. So like that's why
Yes.
it's not certain which version of that feedback you're getting. So you have to kind of like ask a follow-up question or something. It's like,
Yeah.
well, why do you want more? Like, did I leave something out or you just love the character that much?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think a lot of times when you get that feedback in a workshop, maybe people intend it as a compliment and really like I see it as a flaw.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe they intend it as a compliment because they do view it as a flaw. But a lot of times I just feel like when people are like saying that, it's like they're swept up with the potential of a story and they don't really realize that it's not something that the author has been able to accomplish.
The author doesn't necessarily need to accomplish it, but sometimes the author hasn't accomplished it
Yeah.
or hasn't accomplished what a story needs to accomplish in order to be satisfying. So the story can be satisfying even if we're left wanting more. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's all I kind of meant by it is like, I think you're right. Like, this Curtis Sittenfeld story ends on a note that has been repeated a couple times. So even though it ends on like, and it literally ends with the word beginning,
Yeah,
it ends with
that's
you
right.
kind of hoping that there is something next for these characters. It's a satisfying ending because we've hinted at the fact that like she needs to probably make some kind of a change in her dating approach. And after this, you can like pretty safely assume she probably will.
Should we talk about the cliches?
In both of them, or
Well, actually, I thought it was interesting. Like, there's that line in Sittenfeld's story where we stepped into each other's arms. Could be read as a cliche, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah,
you've
yeah.
seen that a million times, but the moment that builds up to it is not cliched.
No.
Because they started off by saying, should we hug? And then there's this whole confusion of like, I don't know, are we supposed to do this? I don't know. And then we stepped into each other's arms. It's kind of like under normal circumstances, that's used as a, loving embrace, like a reunion kind of thing, or like a long
Yeah,
lost,
yeah,
long
yeah.
separated lovers get to finally embrace. But this is just kind of like, I guess we're doing this. So it loses its clichéness by setting it up in a cool way.
Yeah.
Whereas ChatGPT did not do this.
No, ChatGPT doesn't know. It's almost designed to pick up the most popular cliches and use them because as evidence that they're like, correct.
It is a statistical machine, right? It is like
Yeah, it's doing its
find the
best.
most common things.
Be nice to the robots. They're trying.
They're trying. We found all your cliches. We have them here.
Yeah, exactly. We know what you guys fucking like. We're spitting it back to you. The other thing that like I felt like was a little bit of a giveaway was, and I don't know, maybe I'm totally wrong about this, but the section that you read says online for beers. I felt as if I were on a reality
Oh,
show.
that's the New York thing.
Online.
That's a
I
New
was like,
York
yeah,
phrasing.
I was
Yeah.
like, this must be something that I'm not aware of, and
Oh,
therefore not ChatGPT.
if you're from New York, you say, let's get
Online,
online for the movies. If you're from anywhere else in the country, you say,
in
let's
line.
get in line for the movies, right?
Yes,
It's like,
yes.
I don't even understand how that makes sense conceptually, like where that phrasing comes from. That's just how foreign it feels, right?
Yeah,
It obviously makes sense people use that, but in my mind, I can't say online when I mean inline.
right,
But
right,
I've heard
right.
it so often that you recognize it. Oh, that's just something people say from New
Yeah,
York.
yeah. So like I said, I just kind of like safely assumed.
Yeah, ChatGPT is not from New York. Where are they from? Like San Francisco?
Yeah, yeah. I almost wonder if there's like other ways that location might have been like more or less obvious in the Chat GPT version because aside from these like flip-flops, like the coffee shop that they're in, there's like nothing unique about it, right? And like Curtis Sittenfeld's story is very much like, I'm not from here. I'm just visiting. Why didn't I live here? Like it was beautiful. And like Lake Como is like specifically mentioned, It's got an actual like place. Anyway, so the other cliches, I guess you wanted to touch on though.
Oh, there's like this the ChatGPT wrote, Lydia felt a flutter in her chest.
Yeah.
She looked away quickly, pretending to examine her coffee cup, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. It's like three in a row right there. So I think when I read those lines, I was like, I already knew, but I was like, yeah,
Sure.
definitely. Sittenfeld would never write that. She would never put
No.
those lines together.
But I don't even think it's because she's intentionally avoiding cliche. I think she's
No.
just got a naturally strong voice, right? Like she
Yeah.
doesn't have to worry about like, do I sound like an idiot?
Because she's writing. She's not producing cliches. She's seeing
No.
the scene and creating it
Right.
in language. And to do that, you have to just naturally avoid cliches because you're creating something new every time.
Right. Well, okay. And so to that point, what I would say is that it's almost like the reason why this Chat GPT story does feel like a workshop story is not because it's so bad, but because it does read as if it's trying. And
Yeah.
cliches might be annoying to read and they might feel weak, but like to say like heat rising in her cheeks, I mean, that's better than to say like she blushed, right? It's making attempts at language that is beyond simple, but it is still like cliche. And that's, I think, why if this story came to the workshop, I would not criticize it on a language basis because I would read it for what it was, that someone was actually making attempts and they were trying, and maybe eventually they'd get better. But like we said earlier, we would definitely point out the points in the story where the conversation needed to have specifics or to take place on the page or not to be summarized in that moment. So yeah, it's painful to read it. It would be painful in a workshop setting too. I would kind of wish to myself like that there were more to it. But there's
Yeah.
like the language itself is like, I just want to point out that it's not that it's poorly written, it's
No.
that it is boring.
Yeah. Sittenfeld, her commentary at the end is she says, overall, I found it to be proficient on a
Yes,
sentence
exactly.
level, but cliched and also
Yes.
shallow in sentiment. And
Okay,
before
exactly.
that, she
Yes.
said, ChatGPT's story was so boring that I wouldn't have finished reading it if I hadn't
Yes.
agreed to the assignment.
Okay, and so I guess I'm just saying, like, if ChatGPT wants to join the workshop, I would welcome it
Yeah,
because
absolutely. We could learn from this.
we could learn from them and they are trying. And I do feel like we get a lot of stories that would be nowhere near proficiently written and still riddled with cliches. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
How often do you encounter a writer in a workshop that writes perfectly well this way? Everything is easily understood. It does have a beginning, middle, and end. Like the punctuation for the dialogue is correct. You know what I mean? Like everything is like right. There's
Yeah.
nothing, it's without blame that way, but it is just boring. It's so often that it's boring and it's poorly written and it's like hard to understand. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. We've had writers who write these kind of like banalities, like I talked
yeah,
about earlier, but they're well written. You're kind of like, oh, good, I can read this.
yeah, yeah,
It's not the most exciting story in the world, but it's well written. It's like not
yeah,
well written, but it's like it's proficiently written. It
right.
follows the stylistic ticks that you want it to.
And I think that was kind of the point of this New York Times exercise was to say that
Uh,
even though we've trained these robots proficiently, and even though they can help someone like Christine do the occasional copywriting rewrite of something, you know, and like suggest like stronger verbs, you could never use it in place of actual creativity, right? It's not creating something new necessarily. It's repeating to us what it knows we deem correct.
yeah.
So it might be like repackaging it, but it's boring for that reason.
I mean, it is a statistics machine. It
Yeah,
takes in all this data and it like creates weights for possibilities. And those are all based on usage, like what it has discovered before.
right.
A million people use a comma before the closing quote mark, then it knows to do
It's
that.
going to do that. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I don't need to necessarily understand exactly how ChatGPT works to like assume that it will get better in terms of creating something that's harder to distinguish. And how it does that, I don't know. Because if it is just like saying like, well, this is most common, then how do you make it sound more like Curtis Sittenfeld? I don't know. But I imagine like in 10 years, it will be harder to distinguish. And then the New York Times will have to approach this differently, you know, and say not just that we do it better as humans, but that there's something to be learned from humans doing it specifically.
I think they call it generative AI because it's generating sentences. It's like this, you can see this best with the artwork. It's like, all right, give
Yeah,
me a
yeah,
picture
yeah.
of such and such, and like it generates a picture. So they call it a
Right.
generative AI. But I think in the cognitive literature, like in the 50s, when they started using generative as a description of the way the human mind was producing things, like sentences, for example, the generative process in the human mind is more creative. It has
Sure.
like a set of things that it can work with, but it creates brand new things that have never been seen before. Like one of Noam Chomsky, who did a lot of generative grammar stuff. His example, he was talking about being able to recognize grammatically correct things, even outside of statistical patterns. He said, here's a sentence that no one has ever seen before that we all know is grammatically correct. And the sentence was, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is like nonsense.
Right.
Ideas can't be colorless. They can't be colorless and green. And
Yeah.
how can ideas sleep? And how do you sleep furiously, right?
Right.
You can imagine some poetry to it, but we all recognize it at the same time as being grammatically correct.
Yeah.
Subject, there's a verb, everything's in the right order. So ChatGPT works totally differently
Right.
than that, but we recognize that it wouldn't necessarily create something that has never been uttered before, whereas any human being can do that. Any
Yeah.
storyteller can create a story that we've never thought of it that way before. And ChatGPT is not going to, because it's a statistics machine, it's not going to necessarily find. So they have to find some way to have an AI that can be creative, like truly creative, like create things that have never been thought of before.
Right.
That's a difficulty. I don't know how you do that, but
Yeah.
I'm not an AI engineer. I don't have to work that out.
Oh, I don't want to. Yeah, I don't even
Yeah.
necessarily want them to do much better, but your book will have to include ChatGPT type stuff now, right? Like, and this is like after you went to school for all of your stuff, like how the human brain works to create and experience fiction versus how the robot brain works to create, if not experience fiction.
Yeah. I mean, the way it works, like I said before, it's just you're multiplying matrices. It's all math. And then at the end, there's this giant vector that spits out at the end. It's like hugely multidimensional vector. And then that vector points to a region of multidimensional space that has a label. And the label
Right.
is whatever word or word token that happens to be there. That doesn't necessarily mean that ChatGPT knows anything about what it's doing, but that's
Yeah.
how it works. Like there's a word at that location in multidimensional space, and that's what it spits out.
Right. Yeah. So you get it.
See, I don't know how you put creativity into that though.
No, right, exactly. And except that while this story that it came up with is like a lot of stories, it still is unique,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's funny. It is interesting to think that maybe most of our storytelling or the most of whatever data that it was trained on, like so many short stories are this shallow, you know?
Right, right. I think Curtis Sittenfeld is the writer who's got a voice that she couldn't, if you forced her to, suppress. I mean, she's got a way of writing things that comes naturally to her. She hasn't necessarily had to like develop that voice, if you know what I mean. There's some writers who are just, they have strong voices as humans and as writers, and she can only probably write this story one way, you know? And the Chat GPT version, I don't know how else to describe it other than like it being like self-conscious, and we know that it's not because it's sentient. It's because like you said, it's doing all this math and it's just spitting out what it assumes based on all of these factors that we want to read. It's like producing the correct answer in a way. But if you told me that these are both maybe written by like humans or something, I might tell the second writer to just like go for it, like don't be afraid to like write a line of dialogue that seems a little weird or humorous, like attempt a joke, like attempt a sentence structure that is a little different or might take a reader half a second longer to comprehend because you're trying something, there's nothing stylistic about the second one. So I guess my takeaway would be to just like lean into your own voice, because that's pretty much one of the few things, assuming you're a proficient writer, that you have over AI these days. And like you said, otherwise the human brain is coming up with something new. It has that ability to do that. But if you're one of these people that doesn't know that you do have that ability, or if you're one of these people that doesn't write sci-fi, fantasy, all that kind of stuff, maybe you feel inadequate when it comes to like the imagination portion of it, whatever. Just like lean into like what it is it feels like is your personal take on things, You have that advantage.
I had the idea that my takeaway would be using specific details because that's one of the main things that separates her writing from ChatGPT's is that she paints those moments with those specific details so that they're memorable, that you can live in them while they're happening. They're not just airy kind of generalizations.
Right.
Even the emotional moments are specific emotions, right?
Right.
Like the regret about the
Yeah, that's a
I
good point.
really almost never lied. I
Yeah,
deeply regretted the necessity. It's like that's a specific moment of emotion. It's not just like this kind of vague feeling of adventurousness. I wasn't really satisfied with that as a takeaway though, because we've talked about it a million times before. The specific
sure.
details, that's what makes fiction. That's what we should all be doing all the time. I like your takeaway just in the more general kind of thing about voice though a lot, because be human is probably the best takeaway for that, is like what you notice as a human being, what you are creatively kind of drawn to make. You have something in you that is not what ChatGPT does,
Yeah,
right? You're not doing math to come up with words.
right.
You are seeing the world in a different way.
Yeah,
And putting that onto paper is kind of what you're supposed to do as a writer, as a human artist, is
right.
create for other people, like help them see things the way you do for a short time so that they can get that experience. And that's what fiction is for, is to get the experience of seeing the world in the way someone else did just for a little while.
Right. Wow, how inspiring, John.
Okay, we got to end it there.
Before I say something snarky. All right. Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.